So this Sunday, we're doing something a little different. Well, at least a little different for Zoom. If you've been with Woven for some time, you know that one of the things that we do every once in a while in place of a sermon is an interview. And so I wanted to bring that back. And I'm so grateful to have Ellie with me today. Thank you, Ellie, for joining me with this.
Of course. I love the Woven community.
And the Woven community loves you, that's for sure.
Thank you.
So we're going to discuss the end of Romans 1 to continue our Romans preaching series. But before we get to the end of Romans 1, we're actually going to skip ahead to Romans chapter 2, verse 1. And Ellie, as you know, the chapter begins with, "Therefore, you have no excuse. Whoever you are, when you judge others, you're in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, are doing the very same things." And when I read this passage, I think maybe like others, I can, especially through the individualism lens that we as Americans have, I can pick it up as this validation that no one should be judging me, just as long as I'm not hurting anyone. That here Paul is acknowledging that we shouldn't be judging one another, and I should be able to live the best way that I want to live. But I know that Paul was not an American in the 21st century, obviously. So for you, how would you interpret this text?
Well, I think it's interesting that you said that Paul wasn't an American, because in many ways Roman culture was very similar to American culture. We are in a place where we are seen as one of the leaders of the free world, and Rome definitely was that. It held that authority. I think one of the interesting things and the most important things to consider when reading through all of the epistles is that they're just that. They're letters. And these were given in lieu of what we would call a sermon. So the people in these days wouldn't have had these chapter divisions. They wouldn't have had the verses or any of that. They would receive these letters, and then in the church or in a public forum, they would read them from beginning to end. And so for us to kind of extract just a couple of verses from it, it would be like me, writing a letter to my girlfriend, and then like 10 years later, somebody like picking it up and reading like 2 sentences out of it, taking it completely out of context and say, see, this applies to me too. You have
Right.
to read the whole thing in context. And so that's why I think it's great that we're starting at chapter 2, because it really says, therefore. It starts out by saying that, and my evangelical side is going to show up here. We always said in church and in seminary that whenever you see the word therefore, you have to find out what it's there for. And
I like that.
A good number of you probably have heard that before if you've been raised in the church or not. But realistically, it forces us to go back and say, well, wait a minute, what do you mean? And so Paul starts off this letter, which is really an evangelistic letter. He's never been to Rome at this point in time. He has no idea of what is established really in terms of the Church of Rome, other than he knows it exists and he's heard things here and there. So this is really an evangelistic letter, and he starts out with these cultural statements. So when you start at verse 18, and when we're going into these passages that are often used against the LGBT community, as well as other groups. We see that starting in verse 25 of chapter 1, or verse 24, therefore God gave them over in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, that their bodies might be dishonored among them. Now then it goes on to talk about the different ways that existed, and showed itself. And we look at that, and in that point in time, people were probably like, oh yeah, but that doesn't apply to me, that's not me, and I'm not doing that. And then he goes further, and it's realistically, he's casting this net. Now,
because back then, there wasn't same-sex marriage that we think of today, with
no,
two committed people, or a loving relationship, even not in marriage, with two people of the same sex that love each other equally and care for each other and are committed to each other.
yeah.
That's not what Paul is referencing.
Back in those days, it's important to realize that there were power levels, much as we have we've been talking about issues of white supremacy today, that there are issues in the sin of power, and the same thing existed sexually. There are men that took boy slaves in to relieve sexual tension, and it wasn't seen as adultery because it wasn't with another woman. And that was a practice. It wasn't one that like people looked at and said, oh, that's wonderful. And so we look at that, and Paul is again casting this net of what is the one behavior that won't apply to everybody, but people will kind of go, oh yeah, I've seen that, I've heard about that, this is taboo, we're not going to really talk about that. And it's going further and closer in to kind of bring people from a place of, oh those people over there, oh those people over there, and then all of a sudden we're going, oh, I guess that includes me. Oh yeah,
Right.
that's definitely me. And then Paul then finishes off and says, therefore, all of you, everybody, as they say in Texas, y'all, um, are sinners. You've all sinned. And Paul is really illustrating that point. So when we, to take those verses out and say, see, God is specifically saying you are condemned if you are in a same-sex relationship, is completely missing the entire point of the letter, because it continues on to say, all of these people, whether you agree with them or not, whether you think that their lifestyle or their life and who they're attracted to and what they're doing is sinful or not, everybody has fallen short, and everybody is deserving of God's love.
Yeah. The ironic thing is, Ellie, um, as somebody who has studied this scriptures like you, and has learned the historical context that the letter to the Romans is in. When I hear people, or hear or see people use these texts, or this specific text, out of context, I find myself being quite judgmental of them. And I, at least in my head, and maybe with my peers, demean people like that, and elevate myself to think, well, thank goodness I'm not as ignorant as these people who don't understand how to use therefore in the biblical text.
I think that's kind of a continual struggle that many of us face. We have, as we've been talking about white supremacy in different cultures and or different communities, especially in light of the Black Lives Matters movement, we've been talking about how has colonialism crept into our world. You have the Europeans who said, wait, we need to bring Christ, bring our church as missionaries to this new world. And when they came here, they had a set way of thinking, and anybody else's way of thinking and doing life was seen as savage, was seen as
Mm.
unholy, and something that needed to be changed because they came in and said that we have the right way to life, or the right way to live, and y'all need to figure out, copy us. And in many ways that has permeated our culture to a place where we think that we know best for other people, and we project that. And it's one thing,
Wow, that makes me think about how sometimes I am this progressive colonialist, that I am trying to force my progressive views, and maybe not force, maybe I'll give myself a little bit of credit. But I really do think that once everybody accepts my progressive views, that their lives will be better. I'll say, or others will say, that we're on the right side of history. Um, and and I this is kind of off topic, or we haven't really discussed this before, but I wonder, Ellie, is that something that you've witnessed, this kind of progressive colonizing? And is there a way that we, as progressive Christians, or those who are progressive Christians, can learn from Paul's therefore in chapter 2, so that we would be united with the other instead of divided?
I think it's this constant struggle. You know, when I see people being treated badly, and by evangelical churches, when I've gone into churches all over Fresno, and some of the biggest churches in Fresno, and just to ask, hey, can I belong to your community? And I'm told no. Yeah, that makes me angry because I feel, this sense of, but wait, I am a beloved child of God, and there are so many other people that are hearing this. There's so many other people that don't know the scriptures, that haven't been to Bible college, that don't know how to plead their case to a church like that, and they're just being blasted out of the church. And some of them, I've talked to a mom in the Clovis area whose daughter came out as trans and didn't feel supported and then killed herself. So it comes down to the home, and it's easy for me to look at that and go, see, the church is sinning, and look at me, this righteous person. But I have to realize that it wasn't that long ago that I was a pastor of the church in town, and we encountered somebody that said that he was gay and that God had made him that way, and we referred him to reparative therapy.
Hmm.
And I have to remember that this is where I've come from. And it's realistically this whole idea that Paul gets to here of saying, therefore, remember, you all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And you are all in need of God's love. And how then can we interact with each other in that? I liken it a lot to the evangelist that decides that he takes it upon himself to go out onto Blackstone and Shaw with his big cross and the megaphone, shouting, everybody's going to hell, repent or die. And how effective is that?
Mm.
As opposed to the person that takes the time to sit with you and have a cup of coffee and listen to your story and say, listen, this is what I know. Let's talk about this. Let's have a conversation. And in many ways, the church, when I was in the evangelical world, we saw a lot of angry progressives that were trying to demand their way, trying to get their way through Congress, or protests and marches and that sort of thing. And it didn't persuade me to want to have
Mm,
a conversation with them.
mm,
So it's very similar to what we, how we look at the person on Blackstone and Shaw. How can we foster these conversations so that we can all come to a place of, listen, none of us are perfect, but we're striving towards something, and that's the essence of what Paul is writing here. We're striving
wow.
for this gospel, this unity of the good news, that no matter where you come from, no matter what your background is, if we can understand that what it really boils down to is when the lawmaker asked Jesus, what are the two greatest commandments? To love God and to love each other. How can we best do that in the world and recognize that God is present in each and every person that we come across?
That's beautiful. Well, I just have to acknowledge that the way that I met you is by you reaching out to me, I'm going to say maybe 3 years ago, and offering to take me to coffee. And you wanted to hear my story. You wanted to hear about the little church that I was a part of. And then you also wanted to share your story with me, and the good news that you had experienced in your life. And it wasn't to teach me anything. It was genuinely, it felt like you wanted to build a relationship. And I'm grateful, Ellie, that you are the kind of person that has really dedicated your life that I've seen to bringing the church together. And so I'm grateful for that. And I'm grateful for you joining me in this conversation now. And I look forward to continued conversations with you.
Sounds good. It's,
Thanks,
it's great.
Ellie.
It's great, in the middle of this pandemic to have been able to connect back with the woven community. So
Definitely a blessing. All right. You take care.
you too. Thank
All
you.
right. Bye.